Alaska has long been called the final frontier of American expansionism, being located thousands of miles away from the original colonies of the United States and one of the most desolate and least explored areas of any region on Earth. Alaska is one of two external territories of the United States, along with Hawaii, that has a status equal to that of any other U.S. state, being allowed to vote in presidential elections and having representatives in the House and Senate. That being said, Alaska and Hawaii both have very unique histories and characteristics among American states, with one being a freezing tundra and the other being an idealistic tropical paradise. And of course, today we're going to focus on the former. Despite having a very recent history with the United States, what's interesting to learn is that the territory of Alaska was actually colonized by a European power before the United States was even a country. From the 16th to the 18th century, the Russian Empire conducted one of the most thorough and brutal expansions of any European power, greatly increasing its land area through the conquest of the entirety of North Asia, also known as Siberia. After hearing rumors of a land connection between Siberia and the tip of North America, Tsar Peter the Great sent out many search parties to discover this supposed bridge. Instead of finding a land bridge, in 1741, Russian explorers, led by Danish captain Datus Bering, landed, or more accurately shipwrecked, on a mid-sized island off the main coast of North America, now known as Bering Island, in honor of the captain who perished there from an unknown illness shortly after landing. News of this island was soon received in Moscow, and further expeditions were sent to the Arctic, with explorers eventually reaching the Alaskan coast in the following year. The land was declared under Russian rule and incorporated into the empire, and soon small numbers of fishermen and fur trappers began landing in what was known as Russkaya America, or Russian America. Now, the first settlers to have arrived in Russian America were not all strictly ethnic Russians, with there being many Ukrainian and even native Siberians to have accompanied this small wave across the Bering Strait into the new territory. From the 1740s onwards, Russians would settle in the various parts of Alaska, either creating their own villages or integrating into existing native Alaskan settlements. As we've discussed in previous videos, the natives of the Arctic coast of North America are unique among Native Americans since the bulk of their gene pool is from a much later wave of immigration from Northeast Asia, and because of this, native groups from the far north of North America are very similar in customs, dress, and appearance with native Siberians from the far east of Russia, with the two groups having a slight linguistic connection as well. Thankfully, the Alaskan natives did not meet the same fate as the native Siberians of Russia, who were nearly pushed to extinction, and relations between the Russians and various ethnic groups of Alaska, such as the Aleuts and Tlingit, varied for different communities, with some being quite positive and productive, while other relations were hostile. Although the stream of migrants from Russia was always quite small and normally only seasonal, fur traders would take native wives and integrate into the Alaskan society, being very similar to the neighboring Métis people from northern Canada, who have a very similar origin of Native American and European fur traders. Most of the few full-blooded Russians that settled in the territory were either government officials or Orthodox priests, who would often integrate into Aleut society to spread churches across the territory. Almost all Russian interaction with the natives took place on the southern coast of Alaska, with the Inuits on the northern Arctic coast being virtually untouched by Russian subjugation or diseases. Peter the Great also had plans on extending the territory to include many areas of the Pacific American coast, from British Columbia down to California, but these plans never materialized. Russian settlement into Alaska was largely halted at the start of the 19th century because of a lack of interest, as the Russians saw little strategic importance in the territory at the time, and in 1867 the entirety of Russian Alaska was sold to the United States for $7.2 million, which may not sound like a lot, but adjusted for inflation would be around $1.8 billion as of 2017. Thus ended the presence of Russian authority in the American continent, and although the territory was owned by the Russians for nearly a century, by the time the territory was purchased by the United States, Alaska had a population of around 60,000 people, of which less than 5% were Russian or of mixed Russian Native Alaskan descent, with there being only around 800 full-blooded Russians. After the transition from Russian to American rule, the majority of the ethnic Russians were repatriated back to their homeland, despite the American government allowing them the opportunity to stay and become U.S. citizens. As for the mixed Russians, known today as Alaskan Creoles, not to be confused with Louisiana Creoles, the overwhelming majority of them stayed in Alaska, seeing how they were already well integrated into Alaskan society and had acted as a sort of middlemen between Russian authorities and the Native Americans. At the time of annexation, these Creoles numbered around 2,000 people, and the majority of the mixed marriages in the previous century were between Russian traders and Aleut women, mostly on either Kodiak Island or the Kenai Peninsula. These Russian Aleut Creoles had a high position in Russian Alaska and were looked upon fondly even by full-blooded Russians, seeing how they were extremely useful as translators, priests, fishers, and trappers, and they had a deeper connection with the land than their Russian counterparts. In the following century after U.S. annexation, the demographics of Alaska were heavily altered by American policies and immigration, with there being a very large wave of white American immigrants from the continental U.S. arriving in Alaska not long after annexation, rushing to the deposits of gold, oil, and other natural resources that the former Russian owners managed to overlook. According to the U.S. Census, it wouldn't take long for white Americans and Europeans to flood the territory, especially around cities such as Anchorage, Juneau, and Fairbanks, far outnumbering any former Russian inhabitants, and by the turn of the century, only 3 decades later, whites had already started to make up the majority of Alaska. Migration stagnated in the early 20th century, but greatly picked up in the 1950s in a new wave of American migration, making Alaska one of the most ethnically and racially diverse states in all of the U.S. Currently, around 2/3 of the state of Alaska is of European descent, with the largest European ethnicities being German, Irish, English, Norwegian, and French, with most having ancestry from somewhere in the continental United States or even Canada. The next largest group would be Native Alaskans at 13%, with smaller numbers of Native Americans from the continental United States also making up about 0.6%, which would give it the highest proportions of Native Americans of any U.S. state, with the largest groups of Native Alaskans being the Tlingit, the Aleuts, who inhabit the Aleutian Archipelago, and the Inuits, who inhabit the far northern coast of the state and share a common origin with the Aleut people. Those of multiracial origin make up over 8% of the population, giving it the distinction of having the second highest percentage of multiracial people. And although there are no official enumerations on the number of Alaskan Creoles, by using a method similar to what I've done in the past for the Louisiana Creoles, they probably number at around 5 to 15,000, with a median of 10,000 people, or about 1.3% of Alaska's population. Many of the original Creoles were either absorbed into the Russian or Aleut population, or simply lost their identity over the years and became Americanized. There's been a large number of Asian immigrants to come to the state in recent years, especially from Southeast Asia, and interestingly, today the Eastern Aleutian Islands hosts a very large Filipino population, making up the majority in some areas, along with the tip of the Alaskan Peninsula. At one point during the initial gold rush in Alaska, ethnic Chinese made up over 7% of the territory's population. However, this percentage has greatly decreased as they either moved back to China or to Hawaii or California. Black or African Americans are about 3% of Alaska. Yes, there are black people in Alaska, mostly around the larger cities such as Fairbanks or Anchorage. Currently, about 5% of the population of Alaska has some ancestry from areas of the former Russian Empire, although the bulk are merely recent arrivals that have immigrated shortly before or after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Less than 2% of the population is of Russian descent today, with the percentage of people that can realistically claim descent from the original Russian settlers being very small, probably less than 0.5% of Alaska's population. It appeared that the majority of Russian settlers that remained after American annexation had been completely assimilated into American society, although there is currently one town in Alaska in the Kenai Peninsula known as Nikolaevsk, with a population of around 350, in which over 2/3 of the population is of Russian descent and still speak the Russian language, although these Russians simply migrated to the area in the 1960s and are not continuous with the Russian Alaskans. Interestingly, it would appear that the largest impact that the Russians had on the state of Alaska was not in the genetics or language, which is the norm in almost all of Spanish and Portuguese America, but rather in religion, seeing how 1 in 8 Alaskans practice Russian Orthodoxy, including the majority of native Alaskans, giving it the highest proportion of practitioners of Eastern Orthodoxy of any state, proving that the original Russian priests that came to Alaska were remarkably efficient in their jobs. Similar to how Louisiana is the only state with its base culture being French rather than English, Alaska is the only state in the US to have had a Russian base for its early culture, and it's honestly incredible that even a small number of the original Russian settlers and Russian Aleut mixed Creoles can be traced from before America was even a country all the way to the present day. Now, before I end the video, I just want to give a huge thanks to all the supporters of the channel, those that are sure to like and comment on every single video. You guys are the best. I really do appreciate it, and because of your support, the channel is on a massive surge upwards. So, as always, everyone, thanks for watching. Be sure to leave me your thoughts in the comments down below. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.